Dragon Ball is a huge franchise with a huge library of games dating all the way back to the 1980s. But out of all of these games, there are just a few of them that really stand out. Today I'm going to take a look at the best Dragon Ball Z games ever, with the help of my wonderful special guest Flandrew. Alright, let's get into it. While Dragon Ball Z Budokai III is not the final Dragon Ball Z game to use the Budokai gameplay formula, it is the final game to simply be called Budokai, and, at least to me, the final great Budokai game. So, a trend in pretty much all modern Dragon Ball games is the use of what are basically tailored intros for each game. Sometimes they're hand animated, other times they're rendered in 3D, but no matter what, they almost always feel high effort and super hype. For Budokai 3, we got a hand animated intro completely unique to this game, with an instrumental guitar track over the top.
Now, in Britain, we actually had the man himself, Hironobu Kageyama, sing the vocal melody. I guess Bandai didn't want all of you American children to get spooked by this strange Japanese man and all of his un-American words.
Yeah, this is a trend actually. As good as the Dragon Ball game intros can be, the American releases, for some reason, almost always remove the Japanese vocal tracks. It's still technically the same song, just with completely missing vocals. Maybe it's like a rights issue or something? Or Flandrew's onto something. This game is a 2D fighter, meaning that you can only move left, right, up, and down with a mixture of basic movement, dashing, and air combat. You can punch, kick, fire ki blasts, guard, charge your ki, and use stronger chargeable melee attacks.
The combat and gameplay was a refinement from the first two games. The fighting feels fast-paced, fluid, and fun. The game will have you playing ping-pong with ki blasts and teleporting all over the place.
Speaking of ki blasts, in order to use special moves, you usually have to link into them from combos. For example, to activate the Kamehameha, you have to punch 4 times and then press the ki blast button. This is a quirk of all of the Budokai games, and while it can feel wonky if you've never played one of these games before, you eventually do master it and it starts to feel pretty natural. It also feels uniquely different from a traditional fighting game because while you do have to remember combos, there's usually multiple combos that you can use to get the same ability.
Also, this game loves a bit of the old analog stick spin. It's gonna use it for everything. Fatigue, beam struggle, close quarters combat, even on the loading screen to grow these Cybermen. I can only imagine how many DualShock 2 controllers this game is responsible for destroying.
You know a game's good when you're willing to destroy your palms for it. Looking at you, Mario Party.
Things like beam struggles and ultimate move counters do make for nice additions, but they never really distract from the combat. I'm looking at you, Ultimate Tenkaichi.
The abilities that you have access to all depend on your skill loadout, and these are different for every character. You unlock these skills through progression in the Dragon Universe story mode or outright buying them in the skill shop. You can then edit every character's skill set in the skill editor mode or before a battle in any of the other modes. Every skill takes up its own number of skill slots depending on how powerful the skill is, and of course, through special means, you can unlock a skill called Breakthrough, which gives you every skill, but that becomes more of a late game thing. The modes in this game are Dragon Universe, Dueling, World Tournament, Practice, Skill Editing, and Dragon Arena. Speaking of modes, the menu in this game is wacky, but I can't help but love it. Dragon Universe is the game's story mode, and it's told on a per-character basis. Well, kind of. You can do the story with any character in the game, and this is kind of a pro and a con at the same time.
Each character has their own campaign, so you can focus on building up your favorites. Granted, some of the characters have longer campaigns than others. For example, Broly's campaign consists of him grunting, screaming Kakarot, and beating up your favorite Z fighters. Oh god, poor Videl. This is just sheer abuse. Also, can someone explain to me how the hell this choker actually fits around his neck when he has no neck?
For most of the main characters, the story is told from their perspective, but the overall story beats are the same. In fact, it's pretty noticeable when a character who's absent for large swathes of the story basically time warps to later points. This means that you end up just retreading the same things over and over again with a bunch of different characters. I think a more focused story with just a handful of characters probably would have been better, but some people might disagree. A neat aspect of this mode, though, is that every character has their own experience level. As you progress with each character, they learn new abilities and gain experience based on your performance in the fights. When they level up, they earn points that can be put into things like HP, attack, and ki. Of course, as you grow, so too do the opponents, but it's really neat that you can customize each character to your liking, and no two characters will ever feel the same. The World Tournament mode is a classic to me, though, and while there's a bunch of games with tournament formats, this one's more special because it actually makes sense in the context of the Dragon Ball universe. The World Tournament was a big deal, so it makes sense that it has a place on the main menu of this game. While the previous Budokai games were great, this game took everything about those games and just improved on them. The gameplay is solid and holds up even today, and I can say the same thing for the visual style. I also enjoy the really nice variety of characters here too. Sure, this game doesn't have the modern Dragon Ball trend of putting 1,000 characters on the roster, but I think that the characters that are here are a great representation of Dragon Ball Z. But why, of all the Budokai games, is Budokai 3 on this list? There are a pretty hefty number of games that are either Budokai games or kind of considered Budokai games, ranging from Budokai to, Burst Limit, and even Dragon Ball Evolution's video game tie-in. However, out of all of them, the one that people seem to come back to the most and talk about the most is this game right here. In a series with a rich history, Budokai 3 is a solid package with no major flaws, and it's what I'd consider the peak evolution of the Budokai series. As of this video, Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 4 is right around the corner, and people are rightfully excited for it. In fact, when it was announced, people lost their minds, so you can probably imagine how dear this series is to the community. Oh, and before you mention it, this is how Goku says the name of the game on the title screen.
Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3!
Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3.
This choice might be controversial because between Tenkaichi 2 and Tenkaichi 3, I'm gonna go with Tenkaichi 3. And of course, it's a Dragon Ball game, so we're gonna get a totally original intro, and this time it's fully 3D. Unfortunately, still no Japanese vocals in the American release though.
This game also has one of the most bonkers intros, and that's saying something. At one point it looks like Goku and Vegeta are dancing with each other.
Yeah, they opted for the greased up 3D look for the intros to the Tenkaichi games, and while I prefer the animated 2D ones, you really do have to take a step back and appreciate goofy stuff like this. This game feels tight. Most fans of the more modern Dragon Ball Arena games probably have a ton of experience with the newer games like Xenoverse, and while those games do feel pretty good mechanically, there's this feeling of looseness, I guess, that I can't really describe. The Tenkaichi games, though, have this mechanically tight feeling where every move feels calculated and deliberate. To explain the gameplay a bit, the Tenkaichi games are 3D arena battlers where it's your chosen character versus a CPU or local player enemy. While the stages don't seem to matter all that much, there are a variety of stages to choose from, including some pretty iconic Dragon Ball locales like, plains or desert. Okay, but in all seriousness, there are pretty iconic stages too, like the Cell Games Arena and the Hyperbolic Time Chamber. As for specifics, you're able to move around freely in these big empty stages and pull off melee attacks along with special attacks and throws. Unlike the standard Budokai games, Tenkaichi's characters all have preset abilities that can't be changed. While you can still equip items to the characters, these tend to be things like flat stat boosts. This game's Dragon History mode is its story mode. While there's not much in the way of long traditional cutscenes, you do get quite a bit of dialogue during the fights themselves. I actually really like this method of telling the story while not grinding the game to a halt, especially since by this point, if you've been playing these games, you'd experience the same story repeatedly in every entry. I will say though that one of Tenkaichi 3's weaknesses versus Tenkaichi 2 is that some might find its story a bit underwhelming. Tenkaichi 2's story actually had a full free-roaming gameplay mechanic that lets you explore the Dragon Ball world map a little bit, but honestly, other games released since have done this mechanic way better in my opinion.
The characters in this game love to have a good chat. Look, I'll be navigating through the Dragon History menu and then suddenly Goku and Krillin are comparing their wives.
For its relative lack of content, Dragon History Mode does one thing really well, and that's the breadth of Dragon Ball lore that it covers.
This game has one of the most comprehensive campaigns. Every saga from Dragon Ball, Z, and GT are here.
There's even extra stuff here that goes beyond the standard stories too, specifically the what-if stories.
This is a story of two kind-hearted androids.
Yeah, that end up beating the crap out of each other. Oh cool, the Staff Credit Saga, my favorite.
As far as other modes, you've got a few staples here, including the World Tournament modes, local multiplayer duels, and even an online battle mode in the Wii version. This game's got quite a bit of content, and that's before I even start mentioning the character roster. Speaking of, the character roster here, pretty huge. There's representation from Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball GT, and even the original Dragon Ball. On top of that, a ton of characters have multiple forms that you can go straight into battle with.
This game's roster is insane. There are 5 different Gokus, including my favorite mid-life crisis Goku, and this makes up for some wild matchups. Does this count as domestic violence? Or how about Frieza's grunts finally getting their revenge? And of course, my favorite Videl and Fascia in a battle to decide who gets to keep that hairstyle.
Depending on how you look at it, the number of characters on this roster isn't even really close to how many characters are actually in this game. Of course, you're limited by the era in which this game was released, so you're probably not going to see any Dragon Ball Super representation here, unless you're playing like mods. But I mean, you really would be hard-pressed to look at this roster and not find something that appeals to you if you're a fan of this series.
I also really like some of the little details about this game. For example, there's a character reference mode, which is nothing new, but this one has unique Chi-Chi dialogue for every character.
I don't want to see Super Saiyans anymore.
You heard it here first, folks. Super Saiyan ruins families.
And as usual, Goku won't work.
But you don't have a problem with your husband becoming a child.
As always, he has that evil expression. No doubt he's planning something evil.
What, like raising your older son? And she does this for every character, every single one.
At the end of the day, Tenkaichi III is a pure and distilled Dragon Ball brawling experience that any fan of the franchise would enjoy. It feels distinctly different from the modern games too, which is why many people prefer it to newer stuff like Xenoverse. Fortunately, we're getting a Tenkaichi IV soon, and I'm optimistic that some of the soul of this game will hopefully make it into the new one. Hi there. I'm Calmsai, here for your brief intermission. Flandrew made an accompanying video on his channel covering the worst Dragon Ball games, so make sure to check that out. If you're here from his channel, welcome. We're all in good company here. I hope you're doing okay. You're looking swell today. Did you change your hair? Either way, it looks very nice. Alright, I have to go now. I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. We've arrived at the game that will never die. The gameplay is incredibly reminiscent of the Tenkaichi games on the surface, but there's some clear differences here. One of the biggest things that sets this apart is the addition of multi-character battles for when beating up one person at a time just isn't enough. The battles all happen in huge 3D arenas similar to the Tenkaichi games. What's neat though is that the addition of multiple characters in these fights means that just because you've lost your HP doesn't mean the fight is necessarily over. Any player or CPU can stand near a downed ally to revive them with a small amount of HP. However, doing this does leave you completely open for attacks and becomes way harder to pull off if you're up against multiple enemies that are still alive. It's kind of a risk-reward system, and it can lead to some pretty nail-biting moments. In this game, you start off by creating a custom character, and this character can be one of 5 races. I'm a Saiyan because I like glowy hair stuff. The story here is a completely unique story about you, a fresh-time patroller, protecting the Dragon Ball timeline from the 2 big villains, Mira and Towa. It's a good story mode, and while it's basically a repackaged version of the Dragon Ball story again, it has a unique twist that makes it feel a lot more fresh this time around. They also went and added in the first Xenoverse's entire story as DLC that you can buy too, so you don't even technically have to play the first game if you're only interested in the story. Rather than using a menu, this game's whole interface is a big hub area called Kanton City with all kinds of NPCs, shops, and even other players if you're playing online. You can run around, emote, hop on a little vehicle, and eventually fly to get to your destinations. There's also a bunch of items littered all over the place that you can pick up, along with shops to buy gear and equipment from, including customization items. You can find Dragon Ball characters standing around in the hub, and as you progress the story, more and more characters appear, and nearly all of them can be picked up as a mentor. They teach you their signature moves, and if you spend enough time with them, you build up your friendship. When you max out a friendship with a mentor, sometimes you can unlock special things like more new moves and even special forms. The hub's primary purpose is it's how you access the game's modes. Outside of the story mode, there's online and offline battles, an online world tournament mode with actual scheduled tournaments, parallel quests, and even raid battles. While I won't get into a ton of detail on the modes in this video, parallel quests are neat side missions that have tons of unlockables. There's all kinds of parallel quests, and they become progressively more difficult as you move down the list. On top of the dense amount of content in the modes, the hub area also has random events that can happen, like for example Frieza's army invading and special missions like making Majin Buu's babies? Either way, there's so much content in this game that it makes a lot of the other games in this space feel like they pale in comparison. That's not even getting into the insanely packed character roster, which as of this video is still growing through DLC. Sure, you have to spend some money if you want everyone, but the fact that there's so many characters here is wild, and very few franchises could pull off this kind of roster size anyways. Overall, this game is a Dragon Ball fan's dream. It's not only packed with basically every character you can think of from the Dragon Ball series, it's also genuinely fun and feature-rich. It's got something for everyone. If you're here for a unique story, they've got it. Want a massive variety of characters? Got that too. Live service elements, including new events, missions, missions, raids, and more, they've even got that. This game is a golden goose, and it looks like they're gonna keep on getting those eggs as long as they possibly can, and for a lot of people, that's an upside and one of the reasons they're still playing this game. I don't know if we'll get a Xenoverse 3 at this point, but I truly have no clue how they could ever outdo Xenoverse 2. Dragon Ball FighterZ is another 2D fighting game, but unlike Budokai, this is a completely different kind of game. This game is closer to a traditional fighting game, you know, like Street Fighter or Guilty Gear, rather than Budokai's somewhat different approach. This game has some of the most beautiful visuals and presentation and just overall production value of any game I have ever played, and that is not an exaggeration. The effects are pure bliss, just total anime quality effects, and every character has a wholly unique set of animations and voice lines, and it's just, it's so good. Like, I could simply tell you why I think this game is so beautiful, but it really speaks for itself. I think even someone who isn't a fan of fighting games would still have to admit that this is a great looking game. Gameplay here is also just, oh man, this game feels good to play. It's well known that I'm pretty bad at fighting games in general, but I can say with certainty that playing this game still feels smooth as butter, even for someone with no skill like me. When you use one of the melee buttons to start attacks, you can keep pressing buttons to dole out auto combos. You've of course got special moves that you can pull off, along with the ability to swap to your secondary character or have them jump in quickly for an assist attack. No matter what you're doing though, the fights look flashy and exciting regardless of your skill level. My absolute favorite thing about fighters though is the ridiculous amount of character-specific dialogue.
Definitely, if you've ever wondered what Gogeta and Vegito would say to each other, well, now you know.
You're even rewarded with extra character-specific dialogue for using specific matchups on specific maps and the dramatic finish sequences. They went the extra mile with these interactions, and then decided to take it even further for an extra mile.
Also, this is arguably the only game in the franchise that's grown beyond just being a Dragon Ball fighting game into a legitimate competitive fighter.
That's a great point, actually. While I've seen dedicated communities for previous Dragon Ball games like Budokai, Tenkaichi, and the like, FighterZ is the first fighting game based on the franchise that I've seen with a mass appeal to the mainstream fighting game crowd. Even EVO, which I'd consider one of the largest and most recognizable fighting game tournaments, has FighterZ as one of the events almost every year since the game's release.
And this is another Dragon Ball game that's had a continuous stream of DLC support since release, which has grown the character roster to one that's beginning to rival the Tenkaichi games.
Yeah, while we're not quite at Xenoverse 2 levels of insanity, this roster is pretty huge for a competitive fighting game. This is especially impressive given that it's a game that's tweaked and tuned for tournament level play, so every new character means tons of balancing considerations for the entire rest of the cast, at least significantly more than your typical licensed anime fighting game. There is a full-on story mode here too, and it's a completely original story mode set during Dragon Ball Super. The whole idea is that you're a soul inhabiting the bodies of the Z Warriors, and you have to help them go up against Android 21, the main antagonist of the game, and the main antagonist of the game's meta for a while too. While Dragon Ball FighterZ is different from your average Dragon Ball game, its strength is in the sheer polish it has. If you're a fan of incredible visuals, you're covered. If you're a fan of easy to learn, hard to master gameplay mechanics, you're covered there too. FighterZ has so much going for it that I'm not surprised at how popular it still is, even with other Dragon Ball games coming out at a steady pace since its release. Dragon Ball Z Legacy of Goku 2, the second of a series of Dragon Ball RPGs that only ever came to the Game Boy Advance, and it's the direct sequel to a game that's widely considered to be the worst. What makes this such a good game? Because he has a lot more experience with this game, I'm gonna let Flandrew take the reins on this one.
Legacy of Goku 2 is an example of a sequel that improves on the original in every way, and this is evident right from the start. The game opens with the tragic story of future Trunks losing his master at the hands of the evil androids. An action-packed prologue that also works as a tutorial for the combat. Now compare that with having to collect porn magazines at the start of the first game. The game is also much larger in scope. Just look at how much bigger Goku's house is compared to the first game. And you can actually go inside as well. The combat feels way more responsive and the bosses actually have a health bar this time. There's also a decent level up system, a proper objectives journal, and a world map. This is the first world map I ever remember seeing in a Dragon Ball game. They actually used the official Toriyama map, and it's the same map still used in Kakarot all these years later. For some reason, Goku was the only playable character in the first game, which made absolutely no sense because that game covered the Saiyan and Frieza arcs, a time where Goku was either dead, traveling to Namek, or recovering in a Bacta tank. Now, the developers learned their lesson with the sequel, allowing for 5 playable characters, each with their own special moves and transformations. Although Piccolo's transformation is just him taking his clothes off. However, Legacy of Goku 2 still has his fair share of random filler that's used to pad out the game. Who can forget Goku rescuing some random schoolchildren? Or trying to sneak a dinosaur egg past some leather daddy tigers? Or Vegeta versus the alligators? But my favorite has to be Piccolo versus the Triceratops. Boy, they really missed out not having this in the anime. But you know what, this game gets so much right that it kind of makes you overlook all the padding. Apart from being very faithful to the anime, it has a large world map filled with secrets and Easter eggs. Overall, Legacy of Goku 2 is a textbook example of how to make a good sequel. It takes the first game, which just so happens to be on our worst Dragon Ball games list, which you can check out here, and improves it in every single way. There was also a third game, Buu's Fury, which feels very much like a continuation of this game with some incremental improvements. Many people see that as the best game of the trilogy, but we decided to go with the second game due to its massive jump in quality.
I think the best thing about Legacy of Goku 2 is the freedom you're given to break into private residences and just ram into people. For a 2D RPG, they still somehow nailed that nostalgic Dragon Ball feeling. Part of it is the fact that this game uses the Bruce Faulconer soundtrack for its music, which, for those like me who grew up with the Funimation dub, it's just pure nostalgic goodness. While this game seems to stand on its own merits, something that I think makes it seem even better in retrospect is just how much of an improvement it was over the first game. Definitely check out Flandrew's video for more on, that experience. Believe it or not, large-scale Dragon Ball RPGs treated as major releases are few and far between. Sure, you could consider Xenoverse 2 an RPG, but there's clearly a different philosophy behind Dragon Ball Z Kakarot's entire formula. This game has a full intro using the vocal version of Cha-La Head Cha-La, but instead of just rehashing the classic intro, it's actually completely unique and a showcase of a ton of Dragon Ball Z moments. I really enjoy this opening, especially since I was expecting it to just be a straight-up remake. On top of that, like I said, we actually got the song with the original vocals intact in America. Finally! So coming right off of Xenoverse 2, this game on the surface definitely looks a lot like that game, but it feels fundamentally different in almost every way. The gameplay here is broken into what is basically 2 different systems, the exploration and the battles.
As a child playing Legacy of Goku on the Game Boy Advance, this is what I envisioned future Dragon Ball games would be like.
Oh yeah, this game takes everything that those games did and cranks it up to 11. In this game, you're on a huge map, and that's what sets it apart from pretty much every Dragon Ball game before it. The map is broken up into different zones, and each zone is fully explorable on foot and in the air. Throughout these zones are NPCs, explorable cities, wildlife you can catch and fish for food, and collectible items like Z-orbs that you can use on skill trees.
And of course, is it even a modern open world game if it doesn't have a fishing minigame? Although this one does take a slightly different approach. Instead of a fishing rod, Goku pulls his tail out of God knows where, uses it as bait, and then punches the fish into submission.
Who thought this was a good idea? Who didn't see this and immediately think, you know what this looks like, right? I don't think it's a stretch to say that this is the most fully realized interactive version of Dragon Ball's world ever made.
It's really nice to see the developers really lean into the quirks of Toriyama's world. Just look at the citizens of West City. You've got a bear, a hippo, Frosty the tiger. I mean, sure, every now and then it has 2 identical grannies crossing paths, but it wouldn't be a Dragon Ball game if they didn't cut some corners. Like Vegeta still wearing his pink shirt and yellow trousers while training in the gravity room.
Throughout this world, you can find enemies scattered all over the place. What's super neat though is that you can expend ki to air dash in any direction. This is definitely a way to get around faster.
Or, you know, you just be flying through the air minding your own business and then accidentally run into one of Frieza's henchmen.
Yeah! This is how I imagine most fights would realistically go if you actually lived in this world. The exploration here, though, is for me one of the biggest highlights of this game. I haven't even gotten into the actual fighting mechanics here because there truly is a sense of childlike wonder being able to explore these places in such detail. Seeing all of these little touches that otherwise would never make it into a standard Dragon Ball game.
And this game really expands Dragon Ball's lore. For example, I never knew how much Vegeta loved apples.
Well now, this should be worth eating. Ooh, might keep that apple.
So typically you have a main objective that you fly to in the overworld, and when you get there you see a cutscene and then engage in a story battle. It's pretty straightforward stuff. The actual battle systems here are pretty self-explanatory at this point, especially if you understand how previous games like Xenoverse worked. You have a big open area, along with a variety of basic attacks, ki blasts, and abilities that you can activate. You can also use items and bring in a support character to use one of their special moves. Something a bit different that you may notice, though, is the addition of damage numbers. While this isn't functionally different from how the other arena battle games do it, the numbers do make this feel more like an RPG at times. As you play and grow your characters, you have the perfect visual indicator that you're getting stronger because, well, number go up. I love how in between missions, the narrator pops in and makes you feel like you're binge watching episodes of Dragon Ball Z. There's something about that that makes it feel a lot more nostalgic to me. What's neat is that you're not just going from mission to mission, there's a bunch of side missions too.
I mean, you even get the driving episode as a main mission. I mean, sure, Goku and Piccolo aren't wearing their fresh Prince of Bel-Air outfits in this one, and the collision detection is non-existent, but still, it's the driving episode in a video game.
Yeah, this game takes its time to really get into the nitty-gritty of Dragon Ball lore. I'm so used to these games just rushing through every big plot point and fight that it came as a pretty big shock to me that there was a whole mission early on where you have to go and find Launch for Master Roshi. How often does Launch actually appear in these games outside of, like, I don't know, the menus? So Kakarot, the game, not the character, is one of those special games that I think came out at the perfect time. When you think of Dragon Ball Z games, you probably immediately think of the straightforward fighting games like Xenoverse, Fighters, or even the Tenkaichi games. Kakarot is one of those things that I think may have been a gamble conceptually for the developer, since you'd probably have to sell the idea to modern fans. I mean, it helps that the actual battles look a lot like the games that we're all used to, but this game is so much more than just the fights, and I think that that's what makes it one of the best Dragon Ball games ever. So tell me, do you think we missed anything on this list? Or better yet, is there something that you think doesn't belong on this list? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts, especially since if you've watched this far, you're probably at least a little bit of a Dragon Ball fan. And before I go, I really need to give a huge shout out to Flandrew. He has been an absolute joy to collaborate with for this video, and if you're unfamiliar with this channel, please go check it out. There will be a link to his channel and to his video covering the worst Dragon Ball games in the video description. I also want to note that some of these games we talked about in this video have actually appeared on my channel before, and if you want more of a deep dive into those games, definitely check out those videos on my channel. I'll put the links to both those videos and my Dragon Ball playlist in the description. And finally, I really want to give a huge thanks to my patrons, including That's Ash and Megan, in the Played Every Game tier, along with all of the wonderful folks that you see on your screen. I am super grateful for your support. As always, thank you so much for watching and have a fantastic day.